guess in China it's a bit more of like, if you don't do it, 10 other people, they will do the job possibly at half the price and equal the qualities.
Hi everyone, I'm Helen. I'm a product manager at a late-stage startup in Southeast Asia. Have you realized that there are more and more Chinese tech companies in the region nowadays, from big companies like ByteDance, Tencent, NetEase, Alibaba? All of them are setting up offices in Southeast Asia. And why is that so? Also, what's the difference between working in these big Chinese tech companies versus smaller ones? Today, we're about to find out. I'm super excited to welcome my friend Chan Wei, who has worked in a myriad of Chinese tech companies in Southeast Asia. He is now a senior product manager at NetEase, and previously he has worked in GARENA.
Hi Helen, very glad to be here with you and on the channel.
Welcome, welcome. Chan Wei, how would you compare the product culture between bigger Chinese tech companies, NetEase, versus smaller ones or more medium-sized ones like OlaChat?
NetEase overall, much bigger company than OlaChat. OlaChat, the parent company in China was about 1,000 employees. So basically comparing a big and a medium-sized company, the smaller the company is, it's a bit more open to trying other, methods to experimentations. If a Chinese company were to bring in Western ways of thinking, it's more likely to happen in a medium or small-sized Chinese tech company. Let's just think simply in terms of working software. In OlaChat, we actually used a variety of Western apps such as Trello, Figma, we even use Gather for virtual meetings at NetEase. And from what I observe of bigger tech companies, simply even in terms of software, you won't really see them using Western software of collaboration tools, etc. Sometimes it can even be quite primitive, such as, their version of Google Sheets and Google Docs. In some sense, it gets the work done. But it's more of just overall, it's just maybe they just change a little bit slower.
Big Chinese tech companies, Ali, they use TikTok for their messaging.
Yeah.
ByteDance, they use Lark because they also have enough resources to all do this research and development into their own enterprise apps. Whereas for smaller companies, they don't even have that resource.
So it's a little bit of both, right? It's a bit of, let's just be our biggest client for our own product. Secondly as well, slight reservations and even more of a concern, if I use Zoom, how secure is my meeting? If I use even Google Sheets, what happens to my data? What does Google do with it? Maybe smaller Chinese tech companies share the concern as well, but they don't have a choice in that sense. They are more bound by the resources that they have.
In the headquarters in China, they can't access Google unless they have a firewall.
Yeah, you always have to connect to a VPN. The lack of variety, or rather the reliance on their own tools, it's more of a sign or somewhat of a symptom of a general less of a need or desire to buy into the way Western companies do things. Another difference was, as smaller companies, this was something that slowly changed in the culture, started to be a lot more Western, started to adopt agile methodologies. 3 years ago, there was no such thing as regular one-to-one talks. But even though I feel this is a sign more of a Western than Asian/China thing, my previous company started to adopt it. But from what I've seen at larger tech companies, my current experience is, one-to-ones. Of course, if there's an emergency, you can find your mentor, your boss at any time, but generally one-on-ones is more or less not more than once every 3 months, usually not more than once every 6 months. This is just the way we do things. It has worked in the past. Not much need to change there.
What about product culture? Is it that all the product decisions are made in the headquarters in China, or do regional offices such as those in Southeast Asia have a say in how the product is being made?
Yes and no. When your company is this large, Tencent, close to 100,000 employees, similar for NetEase, ByteDance, it becomes more of a what is your team's culture than what's your company's culture. To begin with, some teams, they don't even want to expand overseas at all. So what is being pushed into, Singapore, you can think of it more of specific business units or teams or products rather than the company as a whole. So firstly, it depends on, the size of the team. But I think also mainly from my experience, it really depends on, the head of the team, what is their way of working. So, so in some sense, it's not a clear-cut example. I've had more autonomy, more trust placed in me, even though I work for a bigger company now. I'm literally maybe about 8 to 9 steps removed from the head of the company. That's how many levels down I am, even though I'm a senior product manager. Whereas conversely, in my previous company, I was about 3 steps down, 3 steps removed from the CEO of the company, but I had less autonomy. It's a very case-by-case thing.
So then it's more endemic of the company culture rather than its size on how much autonomy that you would have. And perhaps it would be also a leadership style that is trickled down. Would you agree to that?
I would somewhat agree to that. NetEase has 200 teams. I've only worked with maybe 5 or 6. And for what I've seen, yes, the 5 or 6 all seem to be, very open, very collaborative. There's a lot of trust. So I can only say that Perhaps this is a NetEase culture thing.
Talking about the different teams based in Southeast Asia and the teams also in China itself, what would you say is the difference in organizational culture for Chinese tech companies in China and Chinese tech companies in Southeast Asia?
Let's put it this way. Not every business unit of a big company will, the boss has the desire or, the belief that, coming out, coming out overseas is a good thing. Usually the very fact that they do it, actually they don't usually have to do it. If they don't do it, another BU can do it. Usually this suggests that the boss, as a whole, slightly more open to change, believes a little bit more in the value of, for example, an international team, international presence, large company or not. If they've come up from China to Singapore, actually, from my experience, it's probably a lot more open than, what people might give them credit for. Because if they are truly close to change, if that's the team's culture, chances are they've not even left China, even today.
How has your experience been working kind of cross-country with colleagues still based in China and colleagues in the Singapore or the Southeast Asian office?
I think what I can say is, as Singaporeans, we always think we work hard, but let's just say that there are people who work much harder than us. So I mentioned this in the previous video. I think the simplest way of looking at it is, fresh grad in Singapore, many companies, you get 14, 16, 18, or even 20 days of leave. In China, fresh graduates get 5 to 7, and I've never heard a single one of them complaining about it.
Right.
So it's just a very different shift. I guess in China, it's a bit more of like, if you don't do it, 10 other people, they will do the job possibly at half the price and equal the qualities. In some sense, I feel a little bit more of urgency, a bit more of drive actually when I work with Chinese counterparts, whether they are at the junior, medium, or even the senior level. I think another difference when working with colleagues in China versus colleagues in Singapore is, I think people who come out to Singapore, people from Singapore, generally, from a product management perspective, it's just simply a little bit more of like, Western ways of thinking versus Chinese ways of thinking. This even extends to the level of, as an example, the level of UI and UX. Product managers, designers, engineers I've worked with in China, they're a lot more visually, they won't be upset by very cluttered UI because this is just the way most Chinese apps are. But people come out of Singapore over time to be like, this is unacceptable. Why is it like that? It's not going to work for the international market. It doesn't even make sense from a design point of view. So at many levels, it is different. But of course, I've also benefited a lot from learning from them. Very different, I would say better, just different ways of thinking, different ways of working, which is why having an international team brings out the best in both worlds.
Interesting. What, in your opinion, is something that you really love about working in a Chinese tech company? And what is something that you truly hate? Or rather, something that you want to change?
I think two things that I really love. The first is the meme culture. Singapore always thinks, we have a very good meme game, with SGAG or whatever. It's 10 levels higher in China. Like, there's literally what we call 表情包. It's basically like a sticker or a GIF. Any situation imaginable to be like 10 different GIFs for it. And possibly the funniest thing is when people turn colleagues, what a colleague has said, into a GIF or meme or sticker that's usually slightly out of context, but it's all in good jest. Never heard anybody complain about it. And it sounds silly, but it's actually made working a lot more enjoyable. Sometimes, your day is slow and someone just sends a really funny or apt meme in a group in response to what someone says. And yeah, so every country has their own meme game, but let's just say that it's much stronger in China. So that's the first thing I found. And I think the second thing is generally 996 is a bad thing. I have not really experienced 996, but as I said, the Chinese, they tend to work really hard. But one thing I would really say is that there's a lot of camaraderie. It's not the type where, if the team stays back, well, firstly, people usually stay back as a team. And when they do, I've seen very little finger blaming. It's a lot more of like, okay, we're in this together. There's this bug that needs to be fixed. Let's get it done. And nobody complains. Nobody, Wow. Sometimes imagine if it was in Singapore, growing in Singapore, it's just going to be like, everyone's just going to be complaining about it and like cursing at the boss. And honestly, it's just not very constructive. This is something that I didn't expect to see in the Chinese companies I've joined. But really so finally, what do I feel needs to be changed? I think it's simply the idea of like the concept of you're somewhere there, but not there. So as I mentioned earlier, yes, it's taken a more open mind for bosses or managers to want to push their team or build a team in Southeast Asia, build it overseas, in Singapore, wherever. But, if you've got the interest level or the desire to see it through, it's maybe it starts at 100%, and 1 year later it's like 70%. And when it comes to like, really deciding, should we take the plunge, should we try this thing out? Sometimes they're a bit more conservative. Yeah, so it extends even to the way of like adopting new ways of working. I've seen a lot of desire. Like, honestly, they really do see the need, but maybe on a personal basis, especially if you're at the manager level, you've been working at China tech company for 15 years, they need time to really adjust to a very different way of thinking. For example, the difference between me and a Vietnamese product manager, the way we think maybe a bit more similar than the difference between me and a China product manager. So I think a way of looking at it is what China calls themselves versus the rest of the world. 国内 and 海外. due to various reasons, such as perhaps the economy was more closed up, due to the fact they have a big population, they've been able to build their own apps and tools. There's just such a big difference in thinking. So all the more, I hope that slowly, especially it starts from management level, and to some extent from the bottom up, slowly they'll be more and more open to, different ways of thinking as generally makes the team and product better.
Right. And has there been any instances or stories that you can share about this kind of need to be a bit more open that has kind of shocked you or surprised you in a way?
I would say overall my experience has been quite positive. So it's not like they don't change. So a couple of features I built, perhaps I would say I needed a little bit more evidence that I would want to convince. But overall, when they look at the stats, it could be statistics, user research, for example, to convince bosses that, for example, this type of interaction, it doesn't work so well with users from, let's say, Thailand or the US.
Right.
They will change. So it's not that they don't change, just a little bit slow. And everyone needs time, but given the fast-paced nature of product management, if a decision can be made in like 2 weeks versus 3 weeks, it makes a very big difference as to when a feature can be brought onto the table.
Maybe it's also because for this, these tech companies, like the senior management, also needs more time to understand the cultural context, and therefore they would require a higher threshold of data or like justification for them to be able to make that product decision.
Yes, that's correct. But it's getting better, and if they spend more time here, as the teams get more established, slowly this can only get better because they are humans, right? First time, maybe they believe you 80% or maybe 50%. It increases over time because the more they find out, the more my bosses, they're like, okay, now I really know how much I don't know. So they're like, okay, if something doesn't make sense to me now, they're like, okay, let's go with it. I trust you on it because in the past, they've really seen that, hey, the way things work outside China are really quite different from the way things work in China.
So then, in your experience, do you personally prefer more of bigger Chinese tech companies to work in or smaller Chinese tech companies to work?
Other product management, I like to spend as much of my energy on product or tasks that are more specific to product management. So one of the best things about being in a bigger company in general is just that you have access to a lot more resources. For example, I'm going to China at the end of the year. Let's just say getting the visa is a lot easier simply in terms of, let's just say, paperwork. Like we got external agency just to handle it. It sounds small, but our schedules are so busy, having just an hour of your time saved per week because of the additional resources you get, that's really important to me. And I think secondly, I mentioned a little bit about how, how bigger Chinese tech companies are a little bit different. So for example, they may not really adopt Western tools, etc. Yeah, to me, that's just a difference. But in my case, I don't think it's a deal breaker. I wouldn't not choose them simply based on the fact that they don't use Trello, or Google Meets. It's not important to me.
When I think about Chinese tech companies in Southeast Asia, the names that pop out to me are all big Chinese tech companies like Alibaba, ByteDance, NetEase, and many more. But when I think about smaller Chinese tech companies, I can't really name them. So why do you think is the case that there is a lot of big Chinese tech companies coming to Southeast Asia, but less so of smaller Chinese tech companies?
I think you're absolutely right, Helen. If people were to ask me, what's the smallest Chinese company I could think of? Apart from my previous Chinese company, I could maybe think of MiHoYo. But even MiHoYo is not that small. It's grown to at least a few thousand now. So why is it the case that you don't really see startups or even companies between 50 to 100 people in Singapore, coming out from China? I think it's two things. One, it's simply the way that smaller Chinese tech companies think. So an analogy for this, it basically depicts a prisoner's dilemma where, there are big pigs and small pigs in the pen. And it is in the best interest for both that the big pigs, they start eating first and then the smaller pigs. So this maximizes the utility for all the pigs. Whether it's a decision to go overseas, a decision to launch a product, decision to have a new type of feature, usually the smaller companies, they take the cue and they wait for the big company. The big company does it. Maybe they would do it, but of course, they're never going to be first to the game. The second part of it is also, I don't really think that they really focus on branding themselves that well. They're not reaching out that much. If you search on LinkedIn, maybe they aren't even on LinkedIn. Well, my previous company didn't want to be on LinkedIn because they felt that the cost was too expensive. I think the reason for that is they also had a stage where maybe they're in Singapore, they just have a small team of 5 to 10. It's a little bit sensitive. If let's say they have a team of 5, chances are maybe some of them, they came out from China. What I mean is that it's not like there are going to be 5 job vacancies for Singaporeans. You have a company of 50 people, at most maybe you have 5 in Singapore. It's a ratio thing. So the chances of you even hearing about their presence in Singapore is going to be way lower.
What is your advice for somebody who is just starting out first product management role to join in a Chinese tech company in Southeast Asia?
Well, it's not possible. It's just very rare that you'll be able to get it as a fresh graduate. Even if you have a master's degree, you need a certain amount of work experience. However, so again, I'm not too sure about how Western companies work in Singapore. At least for Chinese tech companies, I've sensed that they're relatively open actually to people who've not had a product management background. Are you going to add value to the team? Honestly, I think this is not so hard to achieve as Singaporeans. Naturally, we bring a different perspective to the table, which is actually what they want. But secondly, just simply, do you have, well, you may not be a product manager now, but do you have what it takes? I think generally it's just they need to sense that you have a very structured way of thinking. For Chinese companies, you must be able to get along with people, possibly even more, because you're from a very different culture from them. Like if you come across someone that's very culturally insensitive, yeah, of course, I don't think you're going to go very far in the interview process. I would say the main limitation isn't so much that the requirements are very, niche or very harsh. It's more the fact that currently this is still a phase where they are only now, maybe last 2 years growing in Singapore. So the number of product management opportunities at the Chinese companies, it may not be that many for now. And this also means that if, for example, there's going to be just one product manager for a payment system for, let's say, MiHoYo, in that sense, they might be open to someone from a general background, but they will take someone who has 4 years of, let's say, consultancy background versus someone with just 1 year or is a fresh graduate.
It's quite the same for many product management roles that even if you come from a generalist background, you still need to have that minimum years of experience. Chan Wei, are there any resources that you would recommend, for somebody who's really interested to find out more about Chinese tech companies in Southeast Asia?
Well, so it's 2 things: finding out more, and secondly, if ever you want to work with a Chinese tech company, how do you increase your chances? I think the second question is very broad. I think simply about or how will you uniquely prepare for a Chinese tech interview versus maybe Facebook in Singapore? I think simply improving your Chinese. They are honestly been open. I've had many Singaporean Chinese colleagues that the Chinese is not very good and got in. But it would help if you show some interest in the Chinese culture, you watch some Chinese shows, and if the interview, they're okay if your Chinese is not native standard, but if they ask you, can you speak some Chinese just to test? It's definitely a red flag if you're like, oh, I don't speak Chinese at all. Or you start and you literally can't even say your own name in Chinese. It's just a very bad impression, not because speaking Chinese is must, but more the fact that if you're Singaporean Chinese, you've learned Chinese before, and you are going for such an interview, if your Chinese is that bad, it actually says a little bit more about you as a person. I think back to just finding a bit more about these Chinese companies as a whole, I've actually used, it's the equivalent of Reddit, or Ask Me Anything, Reddit. It's called 知乎, yes. So 知乎 is like 知道的知, know, and who. Actually, I don't know why there's a who there now. But it's called 知乎. You can find anything under the sky. It's literally just Google. And the difference between that and just randomly Googling is usually the answers, they're pretty structured. And yeah, anything about upvote or downvote system is quite natural to be able to tell what's more accepted knowledge and maybe helps you to better discern what's good material that's worth your time.
Right.
This is the first thing. I think for the second thing, a little bit more about how you can get more information about what opportunities are there. As I've said, sometimes they don't even use LinkedIn at all for various reasons. I would say it's okay because at this point, most of them have actually a decent presence, at least a few hundred employees in Singapore. So I would suggest through indirect connections, however, it will really just help if you manage to find someone or someone who has a friend who actually works at these companies. It may be easier than you expect because these companies, they are growing. A few years ago, they maybe just 10 employees in Singapore, but today they have a few hundred. So this is probably the best way because it changes so fast. Even if you find a job description, it may not be accurate. So honestly, it is best to get some information from people who are in the company.
Thanks everyone for watching, and thank you so much, Chan Wei, for sharing your insights. If you found this video useful, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next week. Bye-bye.